Welcome to the Scholarly Pilgrim Podcast. My name is John Seaschultz, and I'm a medieval historian. This podcast discusses people, places, and power on the medieval Camino de Santiago. This is a historical discussion that relies on written and visual evidence to paint a picture of what life was like for those who traveled and lived along the pilgrim roads in the Middle Ages. Today, pilgrims traveling along the Camino de Santiago can get a faint sense of what medieval pilgrim towns were like through surviving churches, the rubble of old walls and hospitals, and museum exhibits. In this episode, I will reconstruct what a pilgrim might have experienced passing through a typical town during the 12th century, the golden age of the pilgrimage to Compostela. Rather than focusing on a specific town, I've synthesized the shared features of many towns along the route in Spain, drawing on evidence from royal charters, chronicles, miracle stories, and archaeological excavations. The towns differed in many ways, of course, but they had enough in common that we can speak of a shared experience. Let's begin at the edge of town, on the road in. Imagine approaching a town along the Camino Frances, the main east-west pilgrimage route between the Pyrenees Mountains and Compostela. Pilgrims passed through forests, fields, vineyards, and occasional mountain passes, sometimes with beautiful views, but often through desolate countryside. Rivers and streams often had no bridges, and travelers were forced to wade through the water or use crude ferries. Bandits were a constant threat, and wolves roamed the countryside, occasionally feeding on the bodies of pilgrims who died along the road. By the time a town came into view, a pilgrim might be dehydrated, shivering from cold or sweating from heat, or drenched from a sudden downpour. The path narrowed towards a bridge or gate, and the landscape began to change, with fields giving way to clustered roofs, smoke rising, and a church tower visible above the town. On the outskirts of these towns, pilgrims would have passed hospitals dedicated to St. Lazarus that cared for lepers, and might have seen some of the most visibly afflicted begging for alms. Leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, caused skin lesions, nerve damage, and progressive deformity, and it was widespread in the Middle Ages. Leprosy was not easily transmitted, and it wasn't particularly deadly, but it caused great fear and led to social ostracism, one reason leper hospitals were deliberately placed outside the town walls. The approaches to towns were sometimes lined with stalls where merchants sold food and wine or repaired shoes. Some towns stretched so far along the road that pilgrims referred to them as long towns. Before entering, pilgrims often had to cross a bridge where officials collected tolls, sometimes from a defensive tower built into the bridge itself. Tolls were also collected at other strategic points along the route, and pilgrims were technically exempt from these payments, but the exemption was loosely enforced. There were reports of pilgrims being beaten and searched down to their undergarments to extract the required money. Towns of any consequence were walled with stone, and the gates were closed at night. By the 12th century, most of these towns were far from the Muslim frontier, so the walls increasingly served as much to protect local properties, assert jurisdiction, and keep rival lords at bay as they did to defend against external attack. Most of these urban walls are gone today. As royal power consolidated across the Spanish kingdoms, local lords gradually lost their autonomy, and their walls lost their purpose. At pilgrim towns such as Mansilla de las Mulas and Carrion de los Condes, fragments of the medieval walls remain, giving a sense of how these towns were once fortified. Order within the walls was maintained by local lords, who were responsible for tax collection, security, and justice. These lords came from a variety of backgrounds, including members of the nobility, bishops, and abbots. Some towns had military orders such as the Templars or Hospitallers as their local lords, and they would have provided security in and around the town. Royal officials were also present. their primary concern being to ensure the crown received its share of fines, taxes, and other revenues. Pilgrims would have walked on streets of packed dirt or mud, though some of the larger trading hubs may have had uneven stone paving. Most buildings, apart from churches, monasteries, and the homes of the wealthy and nobility, were modest timber and thatch structures. Stone was expensive and mostly reserved for buildings of religious or civic importance. The common wooden structures of townspeople were lit by candles, making fire a constant danger in the densely packed streets. Moving through the streets, pilgrims would have encountered all types of people: priests and monks in their robes, merchants and craftsmen at their stalls, locals going about their daily business, and fellow pilgrims from across Europe, some traveling alone, and others in groups. Townspeople typically wore long wool tunics tied with a belt around the waist. The poor wore coarse, unbleached wool or linen that grew stiff and heavy when wet. In contrast, wealthy merchants and members of the nobility favored tunics made of fine imported wool, linen, or silk. These elites wore cloth colored with expensive dyes, and some wore furs to show their status. Pilgrims would have been recognized by their walking staffs, gourds for carrying water or wine hung from their belts or staffs, and leather purses made from deerskin. Most pilgrims were men, although some women also made the journey. To protect against the blazing sun or driving rain, they relied on wool hoods and simple cloth head coverings. The broad-brimmed hat, so familiar in later medieval art, was probably quite rare in the 12th century. Many pilgrims also wore a short cape. It protected the upper body from rain while remaining short enough not to drag in trail mud or encumber the legs on the road. In cooler weather, some also wore a loose outer garment for additional warmth. Pilgrims wearing scallop shells on their capes were likely on their way back from Compostela. They wore these shells as visible signs that they had reached the shrine of St. James. Although shell vendors operated in many towns along the Camino, the church insisted that these badges be obtained in Compostela and threatened unauthorized vendors with excommunication. Shoes and boots were often made of goat skin or ox leather. Some wore sandals or clogs that kept the leather shoes out of the mud and snow. The leather soles and heels of shoes wore out frequently, so pilgrims would have been in constant need of shoe repair or replacement. Pilgrims could have been recognized by their distinctive clothing and badges, but it was languages and accents that would have identified a fellow traveler from their home region. They likely exchanged news from home and advice about the road ahead. As they entered the town, pilgrims would have experienced an intensifying mix of strong smells and sounds. In addition to the body odor of their fellow unwashed travelers and locals, human waste was dumped into pits, the streets, and nearby creeks and rivers. Tanneries, often located along those same creeks and rivers on the edges of town, filled the air with foul odors that drifted through the streets. Tanners turned animal hides into leather that could be crafted into finished goods like shoes, purses, and saddles. To process the hides, they were often soaked in animal waste and stale urine, which resulted in a stench like rotting flesh, stagnant water, and ammonia. But there were also other smells: fish from the fishmonger shop, bread baking in the bakery, blood from the butcher shop where animals were often displayed before slaughter on the day of sale, and smoke from burning fires used to heat homes and cook food. There were distinctive sounds, too: the drone of chatter, church bells calling the faithful to Mass, and the clanging of blacksmith's tools. The Camino typically passed through the center of town, where there was a church, frequently dedicated to St. James or to other saints important to local populations. Larger towns had multiple parish churches, each serving the residents of its surrounding neighborhood. Pilgrims attended Mass at these churches and made donations of coins and wax. When the bells rang for Mass, pilgrims and locals milling about the town would have filed into these places of worship, joining together in prayer before returning to the routines of daily life. Some churches were attached to monasteries, some of which dominated the town's religious life and promoted the cults of local saints. Others belonged to monastic or military orders. Larger towns also had cathedrals where bishops presided over elaborate religious ceremonies. The areas inside and around churches were considered protected sacred spaces. Their sculptures were a visual language for pilgrims, most of whom could not read. Animals and fantastic creatures symbolized vice and virtue. Biblical stories and scenes of the Last Judgment filled the walls and facades. For pilgrims seeking eternal salvation, the image of Christ in majesty, ruling over the saved and the damned, often shown above the main door, would have resonated deeply. Busy markets were often held in the open spaces in front of the town's main church. The coexistence of markets in the shadow of the church reflected the complex relationship between economics and religion at that time. Commerce and profit were understood through a moral lens, rooted in scripture and church teachings. By the 12th century, avarice, or greed for money and material possessions, had become the principal sin in the eyes of the church. Anyone who handled money had to tread carefully or risk eternal damnation. Those warnings also appeared in stone. Some church sculptures along the Camino depict figures burdened by heavy bags of coins hanging from their necks, a stark warning to merchants and pilgrims alike that avarice could stand between them and eternal salvation. Pilgrims were supposed to travel in a spirit of voluntary poverty, following the example of Christ and the apostles. They could carry enough money to sustain themselves on the journey, but any surplus was expected to go to the poor as alms or to churches as donations. In practice, however, that was not always the case. Contemporary sources describe some pilgrims traveling with much money, diverse treasures, and great wealth. That wealth made them attractive targets, and many townspeople sought to make a living from pilgrims passing through. Some were legitimate traders and service providers, but others were not. Fraud was common. Watered-down wine, false weights, and overcharging were regular complaints. Many of the historical sources describing fraud and exploitation along the Camino were written by clerics with their own concerns about the sin of avarice. This was also a period when the money economy was expanding rapidly across Western Europe. The reality in these towns was probably somewhere between the worst abuses the church condemned and the everyday commerce that kept these towns alive. Traders operating from stalls lining the Camino, which typically formed the town's main street, served locals and pilgrims throughout the week. Weekly markets were much larger affairs, drawing buyers and sellers from across the region and beyond. Merchant caravans from outside the peninsula were known to arrive for these weekly markets, carrying a wide variety of luxury goods, including spices, silk and wool, dyes, and weapons such as swords and lances. Some traveling merchants even traded Muslim slaves. Before pilgrims could purchase anything, they needed to exchange their foreign coins into local currency. Money changers sat at tables equipped with scales, weights, and reference books listing the values of coins from across Europe. Pilgrims could then purchase food and supplies like shoes, capes, and leather purses. Merchants and artisans weren't the only townspeople seeking to profit from pilgrims. False pardoners, sometimes wearing the robes of clerics, would approach pilgrims promising forgiveness of sins. After hearing their confession, they assigned penances requiring payments that they pocketed for themselves. Pilgrims would have also encountered beggars, faking illness or physical disability to solicit money. Some were said to have dipped their arms or legs in rabbit blood or ashes to simulate wounds, or stained their lips dark. Others used an animal skin bag or cow stomach inflated with air and hidden under their clothing to make their abdomens appear swollen with disease. And some crawled on the ground. Entertainers were also a fixture of the market scene, contorting their bodies, playing instruments, and performing for the crowds for donations. A sculpture depicting these types of performers can still be seen on the 12th century facade of the Church of Santiago in Carrion de los Condes. The same facade also preserves a fascinating collection of urban tradespeople, including a group of minters fabricating coins, a shoemaker working on the sole of a boot, a tailor sewing a tunic, and a locksmith filing a key. Beyond visiting churches and markets, one of the most immediate concerns for any pilgrim passing through these towns was finding a place to sleep. Pilgrim towns offered a range of lodging options, from monastic hospitals to modest inns and rented rooms in private homes. Various towns along the Camino had Cluniac monasteries, and in several cases the town itself had grown up around the monastery. During the golden age of the Camino, Cluny, based in Burgundy in modern-day France, was the wealthiest and most powerful monastic order in Western Europe, and its influence along the route was considerable. Cluniac monks, known as black monks for their distinctive black robes, were active participants in town life, and some even sold their own wine in the markets. Their abbots sometimes served as lords of the town and could punish those who broke local laws. Some of their monasteries also operated large pilgrim hospitals. The Benedictine Abbey at Sahagún, for example, maintained a hospital with 70 beds. Hospitals varied greatly in size and the care they could provide. While hospitals like the one at Sahagún were substantial, most were much smaller. In these hospitals, 10 or even 20 pilgrims might share the same large straw mattress. Some towns also had royal hospitals funded by the crown. At hospitals, pilgrims were typically offered bread and wine, or cider, sometimes accompanied by cheese, vegetables, eggs, mutton, or fish. At larger hospitals, pilgrims gathered at communal tables where they listened to religious readings while sharing a meal. But the capacity of hospitals was rarely sufficient to meet demand, particularly during the warmer months when most pilgrims made the journey. Additional lodging was provided by locals who established inns or rented rooms in their homes. Pilgrims had to be careful, however, as innkeepers were frequently accused of overcharging for food, wine, and candles, and conspiring with money changers to make illicit profits. Some innkeepers also sought to profit from prostitution. Pilgrims might wake up to find a strange woman in their bed, only to be asked for money. Theft was another concern. Local laws awarded damages to pilgrims if their property was stolen and the master of the house was found guilty. Those found guilty were also required to pay a hefty fine to the king, royal administrator, mayor, and lord of the town. To discourage false accusations of theft, pilgrims who lost the trial were to pay a fine to the lord of the town. Wherever they slept, pilgrims shared their quarters with fleas, bedbugs, rats, and mice, and sometimes the ground floor also acted as a stable for horses, donkeys, and mules. Pilgrims likely shared a chamber pot in the sleeping area that was rarely emptied before morning. The smell in those communal rooms would have been substantial. Monastic and hospital toilets consisted of a long room called the necessarium, or place of necessity, with a wooden or stone bench featuring a row of carved holes that funneled waste into a nearby stream or aqueduct. Although pilgrim hospitals provided beds and meals and tended to the sick, they could do little for those suffering from serious illnesses. Some were afflicted with tuberculosis or paralysis, and others developed dysentery, called bloody flux, from contaminated food or water, or pneumonia from exposure to the elements. Some pilgrims died where they were staying. If traveling companions were present, they were expected to carry the belongings of the dead back home to their families. Local laws stated that if a pilgrim died without a will, the owner of the inn where they died was permitted to keep their goods, suggesting that pilgrim deaths in these establishments were a relatively common occurrence. Bodies of the dead pilgrims would then have passed on to the local parish church or monastery, where priests or monks performed burial rites. Cemeteries for pilgrims were often located outside the city walls, as was the case in Compostela, although some pilgrims were buried in the cloisters of churches, as at San Pedro de la Rua in Estella. Archaeological excavations of medieval cemeteries have uncovered pilgrims buried with scallop shells, revealing the importance of the pilgrimage and its connection to the afterlife. The towns where pilgrims ate, slept, and occasionally died were themselves remarkably diverse places. Within the walls, different communities lived in their own distinct quarters, which were themselves sometimes walled. The diversity of these pilgrim towns was not accidental. Royal charters, known as fueros, were deliberately used to attract settlers from across Europe, granting economic and judicial incentives to encourage growth along the Camino. It was in the interests of the monarchs to promote these towns as centers of trade, hospitality, and market activity, both to support growing pilgrimage traffic and to increase royal revenue. Among the groups most sought after by the monarchs were Franks. Frankish settlers came from places outside of Spain, such as modern-day France, Italy, and Germany. They settled in their own quarters, often right along the pilgrim road, where they ran inns and shops, and brought with them their own languages, customs, and devotions to home saints. Saint Martin, whose famous shrine was at Tours in France on a branch of the Camino, was especially revered by many Frankish settlers, and his cult was widespread throughout the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain. For foreign pilgrims passing through, the Frankish quarters of these towns would have felt like a small piece of home. Some towns were even called Villafranca, meaning town of Franks, including Villafranca del Bierzo and Villafranca Montes de Oca. The influx of Frankish merchants and artisans contributed to the growing integration of northern Spain into broader European networks of trade and devotion. Franks often looked down on the native Spanish population, considering their culture to be superior. This caused tension, and pilgrims may have observed friction between the groups in the streets. The diversity of these towns extended beyond commerce to the remarkable mix of languages heard in their streets. Pilgrims and settlers arrived from across Europe, speaking many different languages and dialects. Along the Camino, local languages included Basque, early Castilian, and Galician, while many Frankish settlers and pilgrims from what is now southern France spoke Occitan. When words failed, pilgrims, merchants, and townspeople relied on gestures, pointing, and finger counting to communicate across language barriers. Jews and Muslims were also present in these towns, though both occupied a marginal position in Christian society, despite their very different circumstances. Jewish communities were present in many of the larger towns along the Camino, typically comprising less than 10% of the overall population. Jews were considered property of the monarchs, and their taxes were important to royal treasuries supporting war efforts against the Muslims. The monarchs therefore sought to protect them, so Jewish communities were often located near or within royal fortifications. Jews participated in a range of trades that brought them into regular contact with pilgrims, including winemaking, leatherworking, money-lending, and silversmithing. There's little visible reminder of these communities today. Jews were expelled from Spain in the late 15th century or forced to convert, and many synagogues were destroyed or replaced by churches. Muslims occupied a very different position in these towns. Present in smaller numbers than Jews, they typically lived in far more humble circumstances, as slaves, prisoners, or laborers. Like Jews, they usually lived in separate areas. Some worked as builders on churches displaying the distinctive mudéjar architectural style, as in Sahagún. At Compostela, Muslim captives carried stones for the construction of the cathedral itself. Muslims later faced forced conversion and eventual expulsion from Spain. Looking at these towns as a whole, what is striking is just how socially complex they were. Franks, Jews, Muslims, and native Spanish populations all moved through the same spaces, each community living in its own area, but together shaping the world that the medieval pilgrim passed through. The towns along the Camino de Santiago offered pilgrims lodging and food, churches where they could pray, and sometimes the comfort of people who spoke their language or shared their customs. The experience was far from perfect. Pilgrims also faced overcrowding, dishonest innkeepers, and the many hardships of medieval town life. Yet it was the relatively consistent network of towns that helped make the Camino one of the most popular Christian pilgrimages of the 12th century. If you ever pass through one of these towns, it's worth pausing to imagine the noise, the markets, the pilgrims crowding the streets, and the remarkable infrastructure that grew up to receive them. If today's episode sparked your curiosity, I've explored many of these subjects in greater depth in other episodes, including the Frankish settlers, Jewish communities, and the role of money. You can find them by browsing the earlier episodes of The Scholarly Pilgrim. That concludes today's episode, as well as Season 3. I hope you enjoyed it. For more information on the podcast series, or to provide feedback or ideas on future episodes, please visit the Scholarly Pilgrim website at scholarlypilgrim.com. You can also find photos related to the podcast on the Scholarly Pilgrim's Instagram and Facebook pages. See you next time.